Hi everyone, my name is Abhiraj Garakapati. Welcome to my YouTube channel Amazing Abhay.
I summon the ancient spell. Reveal your worlds. Every story has a world.
Massive stacks of documents in a single day, aided by Philip and Damien. All three had reconciled themselves to working constant overtime. Meanwhile, Hinckley pushed his knights further than ever, forcing them to train while carrying massive boulders on their backs. He told them that as Force users, they must not give up when they hit a wall, but must take one more step exactly when they feel they have reached their limit. This spirit of urgency soon reached the common citizens of McLean. Watching the knights, two lumberjacks wondered aloud if the harsh training was a sign of trouble. One informed his friend about the previous night's attack, explaining that Patrick had nearly died, and that a full-scale war could be on the horizon. The news stunned the other man, who noted that no one else would have taken in refugees like them. They looked toward the knights and agreed it was no time for hesitation. They could not afford to lose their home again. One mentioned he had heard Logan was recruiting for the Vigilante Corps, and indeed, Walter Mean's assault led to a significant surge in volunteer applicants. 3 months passed in this fashion. Thankfully, Logan noted that the Duke had not attempted another strike, with the Civil War already 6 months deep. The elite factions were now clashing head-on. Logan surmised that the Duke likely no longer had the capacity to spare high-ranking assassins for side missions. Patrick agreed, observing that the townspeople were watching them from the streets, likely wondering if they were out on a standard patrol. Patrick noted that the Second Prince's faction was currently being pushed back. Watching a group of children playing in a sandbox, Logan explained that the opposition had consistently lost ground on the Central Front and had been driven all the way west to the border of the Walter Mean territory and the Royal Domain. They had even lost one of the strategic twin castles. Logan reflected on his own contribution to this shift. By seizing Bofro's territory, he had severed a core power and a vital supply line for the Second Prince's faction. To maintain their strength, they were now likely forced to shoulder the burden of supplying their allies as well, causing the losing faction to collapse even faster, a result that aligned perfectly with Logan's plans. Patrick spoke up, admitting that while it might be unbecoming of a knight to say so, the Civil War had allowed their house to grow tremendously. By recruiting knights from families ruined by the conflict, their numbers had swelled to 170, surpassing the force they held prior to the Tomoto Castle campaign. Furthermore, these new recruits appeared genuinely loyal. As Logan and Patrick passed, the knights turned to salute them with smiles on their faces. Logan calculated their total strength, including crossbow cavalry, trainees, and regular troops. They now commanded 3,500 active soldiers. When factoring in the 5 castles taken from Bofro's, plus Sylvan and Teslin, along with the vigilantes recruited from other towns, the numbers grew even more impressive. Logan concluded that their total force now amounted to approximately 10,000 men. As they walked, Patrick signaled his approval to the troops, telling them they were all doing a good job, observing Logan and Patrick from a distance. Two knights wondered aloud if they should also approach and offer a greeting. Most importantly, it was clear that Logan's intensive training had borne fruit. He was now able to fully manifest a Force blade, the ability to turn Force itself into both weapon and armor, which served as the definitive hallmark of a high-ranking warrior. Seeing this, Patrick remarked that it seemed Logan had already surpassed him. Logan, however, remained modest, noting that he hadn't quite reached that level yet. He touched his chin, thinking to himself that he still couldn't fully grasp the fourth form of the Divine Sword Manual, the Blazing Flame Slash. Even so, everything was progressing faster than he had anticipated. Logan turned to his father and told him it was about time they put their progress to use. Patrick asked what he meant, but a sudden realization struck him. He asked if Logan was truly about to do what he suspected. Logan looked up at the sky and declared that he intended to end the Civil War. Deep within the southern mountains, goblins were rummaging through a forest when they were suddenly distracted by a strange sound. They discovered an earth golem holding a glowing blue marble, hungry and opportunistic. The goblins lunged at the golem, preparing to devour it. The golem crumbled into rubble before they even touched it, and the goblins began to laugh at its apparent weakness. Their mockery was cut short. A massive explosion erupted, incinerating the goblins in an instant. When the smoke cleared, the golem stood tall once again, surrounded by nothing but charred remains and flickering flames. Logan stepped out from behind the golem, satisfied with the results. He remarked to Clayton that the power output of the marble was excellent, noting that the only remaining task was to shorten the activation time by about half a second. Clayton nodded, promising to keep that in mind. Hammer then approached Logan, informing him that they had already used up all the prototypes they had brought and suggesting they head back. Logan was incredulous. He had told Hammer to bring more, but Hammer had assumed a single crate would suffice. Despite the shortage, Logan was pleased with the performance. Clearing an entire goblin village had taken only an hour. He called the results encouraging, but the group was suddenly interrupted by a violent shaking of the earth. A scream, so powerful it hurt their ears, echoed through the mountains. Clayton identified the sound as coming from the distillation zone, but Logan didn't waste time analyzing the source. He leaped away immediately, telling the others they needed to find a safe location first. The three men eventually caught their breath in the shade of some trees. When Clayton asked what that creature had been, Logan admitted he didn't know, but surmised the sound of the balm must have awakened a local predator. Looking back toward the path they had fled, Logan noted that the deep regions of the southern mountains were famous across the continent for being a dangerous, demonic zone. Noticing Clayton and Hammer were still on guard, Logan huffed and praised them for a job well done. He remarked that despite having very little intelligence to go on, the final product had turned out better than he expected, perhaps even more effective than the version he remembered from his previous life. Clayton explained that the balm named Liberatio possessed firepower on par with a second-class spell, yet cost only a 20th of a first-class scroll, a level of efficiency that was nothing short of revolutionary. Clayton credited the research materials Logan had provided, while Logan praised Clayton's execution. Hammer raised his hand to remind them of his own contributions as well. Logan conceded the point, acknowledging that without the blueprint, replication would be impossible. He stressed that the method for manufacturing Liberatio had to be strictly protected. Clayton assured him that only he and Hammer knew the complete process. Hammer added that without the specific ratios and the mana tuning formula, no one could copy the weapon even if they observed it being used. Impressed, Logan announced that as a token of his thanks, he would increase the Magic Tower's support fund by 30%. Clayton shivered with joy at that news. For Hammer, Logan offered to reduce his contract term by 3 years, leaving the man in disbelief. Logan added one final condition. If the formula ever leaked, these rewards would be void. Both Clayton and Hammer agreed without hesitation, with Hammer swearing on his life to keep the secret. Clayton remarked that since the mood was right, it was the perfect time to show Logan something else. He explained that while they were developing Liberatio, they had also been experimenting with another project. Clayton and Hammer pulled out an upgraded crossbow, proudly calling it the Rapid Fire Crossbow Artifact Edition. Logan was left speechless. He could hardly believe they had managed to develop an artifact-grade version of the weapon to demonstrate its capabilities. Clayton conjured a much larger golem for Logan to use as a target. Logan leveled the new crossbow at the golem and prepared to fire. In less than a second, the weapon unleashed a rapid succession of shots. The firepower was so immense that the golem was brought down and instantly engulfed in flames. Amazed by the display, Logan watched the wreckage as Hammer asked if it was truly all right to destroy the golem like that. Clayton dismissed the concern, noting it was just a clay doll that felt no pain. Clayton then asked for Logan's opinion, explaining that each individual shot possessed the same firepower as a Liberatio balm. When Logan asked if the effective range had been doubled as well, Clayton confirmed it, explaining they had applied mana resonance to the string to increase the range dramatically. However, Clayton noted the limitations. The artifact fires 2 bolts at a time for 5 volleys. After 10 bolts, the weapon breaks, making it a single-use item. Furthermore, Clayton and Hammer required a full day to produce just one, and the production costs were high. Logan calculated that even at 1 per day, they would only have 365 per year. Still, he decided the sheer power was too significant to pass up. He instructed Hammer to prioritize, issuing the crossbows to the leadership first and commanded them to produce as many as possible over the next 2 months. When Hammer asked why the deadline was only 2 months, Logan's characteristic smirk returned. He simply told Hammer they would be needing them by then. Shortly after, an official notice was posted on the castle walls, drawing a large crowd of farmers and townspeople. The letter announced that the second town in the McLean territory of Tomato Castle was finished and invited anyone interested to move in. Reading the notice, one farmer expressed confusion, stating he was living fine where he was and saw no reason to leave. Another person mentioned that those who moved would be granted a new house and farmland, but the crowd remained skeptical. A resident from the Sylvan Castle territory noted that since the Lord had changed, Sylvan had become much more livable, questioning why anyone would go through the trouble of leaving. Before we move ahead, please take a second to like on this video. A like tells me that you enjoyed this topic. Your support helps Amazing Pie grow naturally. Their home. Suddenly a man at the back of the crowd leaped up and declared that he would go. He and several others stepped forward, willing to take on the hardship. They explained that their original hometowns had already been destroyed in the war, and that the offer of free housing and land was an opportunity they couldn't ignore. As the skeptical man watched them, someone explained that these were war refugees. The man who had leaped forward then led the group of refugees away, beginning their journey toward the new town. Meanwhile, in his office, Logan placed a totem on the map to mark the location of the new town. He noted that the second town was situated exactly in the middle of the plain between Sylvan and Tomato. When he asked Dwayne why he had chosen that specific spot, Dwayne surmised it was because the two castles were so far apart. Logan confirmed this, explaining that the distance between Tomato and Sylvan was a 3-day journey on foot. If an enemy were to invade through those plains, defending the area would be a logistical nightmare. Dwayne asked if Logan truly expected an invasion, and Logan confirmed that he did. He explained that this was precisely why the residents of the new town were required to train alongside the vigilantes. While Dwayne agreed and promised to oversee the training, he remained plagued by doubt, wondering who would actually attempt to invade the Bifrost Plains. His questions were answered as midsummer arrived. Logan announced his decision to officially join the Civil War, a declaration that left everyone in the room stunned. Dwayne slammed his hands onto Logan's desk, shouting that he had hoped his suspicions were wrong. He demanded to know why Logan would take such a risk when their territory was currently thriving, and prosperity was guaranteed simply by staying neutral. Logan understood that if his only goal was to protect their current land, Dwayne's logic would be sound, but he knew that staying on the sidelines was not the answer. He warned everyone that if they remained stagnant, the McLeans would fall, regardless of which side emerged victorious. Both Philip and Dwayne found this view extreme, arguing that the First Prince's faction was almost certain to win, and that the McLeans had done nothing to oppose them. Patrick intervened, slamming his hand on the table with a force that startled Dwayne, Philip, and even Marion. He demanded to know Logan's true reasoning. Logan averted his gaze, introspecting on the reality he knew from his previous life. The First Prince's faction would not be satisfied with merely defeating the Second Prince. They would eventually consume the neutral territories as well. Knowing that this explanation might not resonate, he shifted to a more immediate threat. Logan reminded them that the First Prince's faction included two families they knew all too well. First, there were the Kiros, Marion's own kin, who had coldly cut off support during a previous land conflict. Marion looked down in shame, and Patrick remained silent. Then there were the Wolves, the family that had rudely and unilaterally broken their engagement with Logan. Both families were major financial backers of the First Prince. Logan asked the council if they truly believed these families would leave the McLeans alone once they gain absolute power. When Philip tentatively asked if they should simply side with the First Prince to be safe, Logan knew he had him right where he wanted. He countered that they should do the exact opposite. They were going to join the Second Prince's faction. Kinkley, Philip, and Dwayne nearly lost their minds. They couldn't fathom why Logan would choose the losing side. Logan asked them to consider the politics of the situation. If they joined the winning side now, their contribution would be seen as negligible. However, if they joined the losing faction and turned the tide of the war, the rewards and influence they would gain would be immeasurable. When Dwayne worried they were boarding a sinking ship, Logan admitted the ship had indeed lost its sails and was taking on water, but it still had the power to sail if steered correctly. He then used the one argument no one could easily refute. With a smirk, he asked them, "Has anything ever gone wrong when I acted?" The room fell silent. No one could argue with his track record. Still, Dwayne pressed him, reminding Logan that the assassins from a few months ago were sent by Walter Mean, a core member of the Second Prince's faction. He asked why they would ever side with the man who tried to kill them. Logan's expression shifted, a vein popping in his cheek as his thoughts turned toward revenge. He told Dwayne not to worry, his eyes gleaming with the promise that he would make them pay dearly in due time. Logan moved forward with his plan, contacting Jordan Valtramine directly to declare his intent to join the Second Prince's faction. Upon hearing the proposal, Valtramine erupted, screaming at Logan and asking if he had completely lost his mind. Logan merely smiled, admitting he had expected that reaction. He then, informed Valtramine that if he was opposed to the idea, the McLeans would have no issue joining the First Prince's faction instead. The threat sent Valtramine into a state of visible fury. His eyes widened and veins pulsed at his temples, as Logan calmly addressed him as Excellency, asking if he was truly going to turn them down. Seated in his massive chair, Jordan Valtramine repeated Logan's words under his breath, his disbelief turning into rage. He gripped the armrests so tightly they crumbled under his force. His two servants stood by, sweating in terror, as Valtramine demanded to know how Logan even dared to suggest such a thing. In a fit of rage, Valtramine hurled a table across the room, asking Logan if he was toying with him. His face was flushed and he was sweating profusely. It was clear Logan had struck a nerve. One of the servants, trembling and keeping his head bowed, knelt before Valtramine and held up the communication orb so his lord could continue the conversation. Logan observed that reaction, surmising that the Second Prince's situation must be even more desperate than the report suggested if Valtramine was getting this worked up. Logan continued to speak, mockingly assuring His Excellency that he wouldn't dream of being rude, especially after recently receiving such a frightening gift. It was a direct reference to the assassination attempt. Valtramine fell silent for a moment as he realized Logan knew the truth, but he quickly recovered and denied everything, claiming to know nothing of any gifts. Getting straight to the point, Valtramine acknowledged that Logan wasn't reaching out of the goodness of his heart. He demanded to know what Logan's true goal was. Logan replied that his request was quite reasonable. In exchange for their support, he wanted formal recognition of the Beffro's lands the McLeans had already seized, half of the Marquicalia territory adjacent to McLean, and the return of the township his ancestors had lost. Logan made it clear he would need guarantees for all three. Valtramine asked if he was serious, and Logan stood his ground, stating that considering the immense risk they were taking by joining the losing side, the demands were not excessive. Valtramine began to laugh, a large, menacing smile spreading across his face. He told Logan that such requests weren't even worth negotiating. However, he offered a challenge. If Logan had the courage to say those same things to his face, he would acknowledge them. To Valtramine's surprise, Logan didn't hesitate. After a few seconds of silence, he accepted the invitation to speak face to face, smiling. Logan told him he would be paying him a visit very soon. The scene shifted to Beffro's castle, where a unit of knights had been assembled to escort Logan to Valtramine's camp. They had prepared 2 to 3 weeks' worth of supplies for the journey. Just before they set out, Patrick called out to Logan. His voice was thick with concern, as he asked his son if those demands hadn't been a bit too much, expressing his fear that they would simply be used as cannon fodder. Logan turned to his father with a confident smile, replying that right now, the Second Prince's faction was so desperate, they would welcome even cannon fodder with open arms. Logan reminded Patrick that even he had given his approval after witnessing the sheer power of the Liberatio. Patrick conceded the point, admitting it was certainly one hell of a weapon. As the perspective briefly shifted to Hinckley smiling toward Eileen, Patrick continued, noting that even the retainers had acknowledged the weapon could turn the tide of the war. However, Patrick's true concern lay elsewhere. He wondered if they could truly protect such a powerful asset. He then asked Logan if his ultimate intention was truly to place the Second Prince on the throne. Patrick broke into a cold sweat and lowered his head. He thought back to the Grand Nobles incident, the spark that had fully ignited the Civil War. He remembered watching the death of Larry Klett and noticing that Logan had been smiling at that very moment. Patrick suspected he understood the meaning behind that smile, and he wondered if this current intervention was merely a continuation of those events. Logan spoke up, telling Patrick that they lived in trouble. Before we move ahead, Please take a second to share on this video. Sharing helps this video reach friends who may also enjoy anime, gaming, travel, cricket, chess, career basics, or personal stories. Your support helps Amazing Up grow naturally. Times where today's enemy could be tomorrow's ally and today's ally could be tomorrow's foe. He explained that in the midst of such chaos, their only goal must be to secure as much gain for their house as possible. Hearing this, Patrick wiped away a bead of sweat and managed to smile. He amused that he must truly be getting old if these unfounded worries were troubling him so much. As the time came to depart, Patrick ordered his men to open the gates, preparing to see Logan and his knights off. As they began to march out, Patrick watched them, praying that only glory would await them at the end of their path. In a final internal monologue, he prayed that if any darkness stood in his son's way, God's light would at least shine brightly over Logan's future. As they moved out, Logan's eyes lit up and a bright, determined smile spread across his face. He ordered his followers to march forward, while behind him, Patrick continued to pray for his son. Atop the walls of the twin castles, a lookout peered through his telescope, spotting something in the distance. He focused his lens until a banner bearing the flame emblem came into view. He whirled around and shouted, confirming the presence of the McLean forces. Hearing the report, Jordan Valtramine stepped forward, noting that Logan had actually shown up. Resting his hands on the stone battlements, he peered over the wall to analyze Logan's approaching troops. Valtramine observed the knights first, noting they appeared to be standard-issue heavy cavalry. Then, his eyes fell upon Logan's rumored crossbow cavalry. He calculated that Logan had brought over 4,000 troops in total, along with a detachment of mages. Standing behind Valtramine was Roger Beffrose, who scoffed, calling the display a mere gathering of rebels. Beffrose insisted that Logan's men wouldn't have had time to recover from the crushing defeat they had suffered at the hands of his own troops. He dismissively suggested that Logan was likely just padding his numbers with raw recruits. However, another man disagreed. Peering through a monocular, he informed Valtramine and Beffrose that the McLean formation looked disciplined, and their gear was far from ordinary. He pointedly asked Beffrose if he was letting his personal bias cloud his judgment. Infuriated, Beffrose addressed the man as Lucian, accusing him of overestimating people with unclear intentions and giving them far too much credit. Valtramine, largely indifferent to Beffrose's outbursts, turned his attention to and asked for his professional assessment. Much to Beffrose's annoyance, Lucian stated that if Logan was truly serious, they would represent a major military force. More importantly, he added with a smirk they had managed to humiliate a count, referring directly to Beffrose's previous loss. Beffrose grew increasingly nervous and defensive, cursing Lucian Thalos under his breath. He viewed Lucian as a lazy, good-for-nothing who only got in the way. He thought to himself that if Lucian weren't Valtramine's nephew-in-law, the sly bastard would have declared neutrality long ago. After considering Lucian's perspective, Valtramine made his decision. He would allow Logan to meet with His Highness, the Prince. He announced they would accept the McLean reinforcements. When Beffrose began to shout and protest, Jordan turned toward him with a look so menacing it silenced the Count instantly. Beffrose realized it was in his best interest to shut up before he ended up in an unmarked grave. Valtramine placed a heavy hand on Beffrose's shoulder, telling him to focus on the bigger picture. He explained that they would use the McLean forces to damage the First Prince's faction, creating an opening for their own turnaround. Beffrose clenched his teeth and lowered his head in reluctant submission. As he muttered his understanding, Lucian watched from the background. With a knowing smirk, Valtramine turned toward his guards and ordered the castle gates to be opened, allowing Logan and his troops to file through. Once inside, the sight that met Logan was startling. Valtramine stood waiting alongside a massive man wielding a giant hammer, both backed by a significant force. Logan noted to himself that it was a grand welcome indeed. As they assembled in the middle of the courtyard, a voice echoed through the air, acknowledging the arrival of the McLean forces. Valtramine and the other leaders immediately lowered their heads in respect. A group of attendants carried a man toward Logan, who spoke with an air of grievance. He reminded Logan that he had previously refused a personal invitation to join his faction, then asked if Logan truly expected to be welcomed now, just because he had arrived with a few troops. Observing the man, both Patrick and Logan shared a silent thought. Who is this idiot? Logan reflected on the second prince, realizing he didn't know much about the man's character. He only knew that while the first prince had been a tyrant who ruined the country in his past life, the second prince had been regarded even more poorly. As Logan knelt before him, he noted that the prince's arrogance was obvious, even at a glance. Around them, soldiers began to shout, calling the McLeans two-faced bastards and demanding they be barred from the faction. Logan wondered if these men even understood the dearness of their own situation. However, looking past the rowdy soldiers to the leadership behind the prince, Logan saw a different story. Unlike the common troops, the commanders seemed to feel a shred of shame for the display. After the formalities, the second prince glanced at Walter Mean, signaling that it was his turn to handle the proceedings. Walter Mean stepped forward and the prince excused himself, claiming he was tired. Walter Mean first addressed Patrick, shaking his hand and welcoming him aboard. He remarked that Patrick seemed far more polite than his son, though Patrick quickly defended Logan, insisting that his son was also capable of being polite. Walter Mean scoffed and turned his gaze toward Logan, who had already wandered off to find Roger Beffrose. Logan approached the Count with a smirk, casually greeting him and asking if he had been well. Beffrose was visibly incensed, but remained silent, merely slapping Logan's offered hand away and calling the situation ridiculous. Unfazed, Logan withdrew his hand and mockingly suggested this was a great turn of events, noting that the southern unification Beffrose had always desired had finally come to pass. Beffrose began to tremble with fury, veins bulging across his face. He hissed, asking Logan if he truly had the nerve to speak to him. Logan thought to himself that while he only intended to tease the man, the reaction was priceless. He suspected that if he pushed just a little further, the Count might actually attack him. If that happened, Logan mused, he could simply kill him in self-defense. The confrontation was interrupted by the Moon Knight, who urged Beffrose to restrain himself. The knight insulted Logan, comparing him to filth and suggesting that getting too close would only make the Count stink. Logan just kept smiling, feeling the insult was a waste of breath. Taking his knight's advice, Beffrose turned his back on Logan, vowing that he would be watching him closely. Currently, Alone Castle and its neighbor Allen Castle served as the twin castles of the Walter Mean Dukedom. Their names originated 1,000 years ago, named after two moons lost in a mythical age. In those ancient times, when orc hordes occupied the southern plains, these fortresses were built to protect the lands of humanity. Unfortunately, the beauty of that ancestral legacy had been discarded. The twin castles had now become the grim battlegrounds of a horrible war. Inside the war room, Walter Mean and the other commanders were finalizing their next move. Logan observed the proceedings, reflecting that this was not a war for territory, but for the throne itself. In theory, the conflict would end the moment one rival prince was defeated. However, Logan knew that neither heir was the type to sacrifice himself for the good of the nation. If left to its own devices, as it had been in his past life, this war would tear the country out by its roots. To Logan, these long-winded strategy meetings were pointless. The only real solution was to kill those who needed to die and bring the chaos to an end. Before Logan could voice his thoughts, Jordan Walter Mean interrupted with a directive. He announced that the McLean forces would be tasked with striking the enemy from the rear, a decision Logan immediately bristled at. He turned toward Walter Mean in disbelief, but it was clear from the faces around the table that the rest of the room was aligned against him. Before we move ahead, please take a second to like on this video. A like tells me that you enjoyed this topic. Your support helps Amazing Pie grow naturally. In the midst of the tension, Logan noticed something strange. One individual was staring at him with a completely unreadable expression. Logan couldn't tell if it was hostility or curiosity. It was Lucien. As Logan wondered what had become of this man in his previous life, Walter Mean snapped his attention back to the present. He noted Logan's silence and asked if he intended to refuse the plan, even threatening to summon Baron McLean to settle the matter. Logan assured him that wouldn't be necessary. He calmly repeated the order back to Walter Mean, confirming that he was being asked to flank the enemy. Walter Mean explained his reasoning. Both sides already knew each other's elite units, so the McLeans were the only remaining variable capable of creating a necessary opening. Logan saw through the tactic immediately. Walter Mean was effectively sending the McLean house to its death. He wondered how Walter Mean honestly expected 5,000 troops to successfully flank a battlefield teeming with over 50,000 enemies. He glanced at Beffrose, who was already grinning from ear to ear at the prospect of the McLeans being wiped out. After a moment of deliberation, Logan opened his mouth to reply. To the absolute shock of almost everyone in the room, he agreed to comply with the order. Lucien appeared to be the only one who had anticipated this response. Logan then asked for permission to plan the specifics of the operation himself. Walter Mean clenched his fist and after a brief pause, granted his permission. After the meeting, Walter Mean stood at the head of the war table with Beffrose at his side. He reflected on his original plan. If the McLeans had refused the flanking maneuver, he would have used that as a pretext to split their forces, strip them of their command, and legally seize their infamous crossbows. If they had resisted even that, he would have forced them to lead a suicidal charge at the front lines. The fact that Logan had accepted so easily made Walter Mean suspicious. He suspected Logan had a trick up his sleeve and asked Beffrose for his opinion. Beffrose, still wary of the men who had seized his land against all odds, admitted that one could never assume anything when it came to the McLeans. Walter Mean reached for a glass as he mused that they shouldn't overthink it. He noted that if someone accepts a suicide mission without protest, they are either an idiot or they have a hidden advantage. Lucien, who was placing the glass in front of Walter Mean, offered a different explanation. It's confidence. Walter Mean looked at the glass, noting that even his own knights would struggle with such a mission. Yet Logan claimed he could do it. Lucien pointed out that if Walter Mean led the charge, the enemy would respond with their full might. He asked if the enemy would really treat a force like the McLeans with the same level of caution. Lucien concluded with a cold logic. If Logan was not a fool, he would deliver results. If he was a fool, he would simply die on the battlefield. Either way, the Valtraman faction lost nothing. Elsewhere, news that Logan and his house had joined the Second Princess faction reached the ears of the opposition. Duke Juan Douglas of the First Princess faction questioned whether the McLeans were insane or if Jordan Valtramine had finally lost his grip on reality. A man with white hair and a goatee dismissed the concern, stating it didn't matter to him. They were nothing more than dead men walking. Juan laughed and remarked that the man's words were a bit cold, addressing him as Chiron. This was indeed Lord Chiron Wolves, the father of Riina, Logan's former fiancée. Juan pointedly asked him if his daughter and Logan hadn't once been engaged, to which Chiron replied with a hardened expression that the bond had ended long ago. At the castle, the gates swung open and units of cavalry rushed through. For a time, both factions had focused on posturing rather than full-scale combat, but the struggling Second Princess faction had now reignited the war. On the battlefield, Logan and Patrick advanced. At the head of their troops, Patrick observed the sheer scale of the army. Even after months of grueling combat, the Second Prince still commanded nearly 1,000 knights and a total force of 50,000. Logan warned that the enemy would be equally formidable, especially with the 100-strong corps of mages under the command of the frost sorcerer Juan Douglas. Patrick wiped away a bead of sweat, noting that they were facing such foes while the Second Prince's main army maintained a wary distance from them. He worried that if anything went wrong, they would be left to die alone. Logan noted that the maneuver was likely born of distrust, which was why the prince's faction had acted first. He reiterated his own objective to kill those who needed to die as quickly as possible to end the war. This move was the first step toward that goal. At their respective ends of the front, Jordan Valtramine sat tall on his horse while the Second Prince appeared as though he had only just awakened. On the opposing side, Juan Douglas held his position while the First Prince sat in his chair, eating. Valtramine finally gave the command to charge. A horn blast signaled the start of the engagement and thousands of soldiers began their march. Realizing it was time, Patrick ordered the McLean troops to move. Their banners stood tall as they advanced steadily toward the battlefield. Watching the movement, the Second Prince asked Jordan if he truly believed the McLeans would mobilize after the humiliation they had suffered at the meeting. Jordan was unsure how to respond, but as Logan strode through the battlefield, he knew the answer would soon be clear. Lucien remained certain of the McLeans' commitment, much to the displeasure of Beffrose. Word soon reached Juan Douglas that the McLean forces were attempting a flanking maneuver. He scoffed, calling them lunatics, who must have lost their minds. While his soldiers mocked the McLeans for treating war like a game, a flag bearing a blue cross was raised. It was the House of Taran Jahad, offering to intercept the flank. However, Juan ordered the House of Wolves to handle it instead. noting that Chiron had made bold claims and now needed to show results. Chiron prepared his troops to face Logan, his mind drifting back to a previous conversation with Juan Douglas. Juan had asked if he regretted breaking the engagement, suggesting that had the bond remained, Logan would have been forced to join the first prince. Chiron looked at Juan, noting that his golden hair and blue eyes were proof of royal blood, and reflected on the duke's ambition. Juan, a mage who took after his maternal side, was seeking to break the limits of his status to sit upon a throne he was never meant to reach. Chiron decided that since the McLeans had strayed from the path he set, they were now targets for elimination. Chiron had told Juan that by breaking the bond with Logan, he had gained a far greater connection to the Duke's faction, so there was no reason to cling to something small. When Juan expressed a lingering regret over the lost potential of the McLeans, Chiron promised to take care of that regret in the coming battle. Juan noted Chiron's confidence, reminding him that Logan's house had been the ones to take down Bifrost. Chiron dismissed the victory as a mere trick, declaring that the true trump card was already in the hands of the House of Wolves. In the present, Chiron gripped a crossbow of his own. His focus was broken by a sudden report from a lookout with a telescope, who informed him that Logan and the McLean troops were approximately 800 meters away. Through the distance, the McLean banner was clearly visible with Logan leading the charge. Chiron mused that if Logan had faced any other border count, he might have stood a fighting chance. Unfortunately for him, he was facing the House of Wolves. Chiron gave the order to charge, commanding his people to use their new weapons to wipe the McLeans out. As his troops surged onto the battlefield, Chiron carefully timed the assault. He waited, letting the distance close, needing just a little more ground before Logan was within the effective range of his own crossbows. He smirked, mocking Patrick in his mind, relishing the thought of ruining Logan with his own creation. However, it was Chiron who was caught off guard when he heard Logan shout for his men to load their weapons. Chiron was baffled. He wondered why Logan was preparing to fire from such an extreme distance. Unaware that Logan had significantly improved the weaponry, Logan fired, and a bolt in. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Amazing Up High. Subscribing makes sure you do not miss the next video, and it gives me motivation to keep improving the quality of every upload. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one.